Okay, so continuing with Mill, I mentioned last time that I'll be talking through just one out of the 10 objections in this chapter, namely the what I call the swine-like objection, and I'm leaving the not possible objection for you all to summarize, as well as Mill's replies to that objection in the reading response. So Mill presents this objection as follows. To suppose that life has, as they, that is, the objectors or critics, express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine. So you remember that both Bentham and Mill have defined utilitarianism as the position that a good action is one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number and minimizes pain for the greatest number. And they define happiness as pleasure, both of them, okay? Bentham is a little bit less obvious about this at first, but eventually it becomes pretty clear that's what he means by happiness. And Mill just outright says it at the beginning, by happiness I mean pleasure in the absence of pain, okay? And by unhappiness, pain and the absence of pleasure. So this objection is saying, whoa, you think that the only thing that it's important to promote in human life is pleasure and absence of pain? That's treating people as like animals. Like, if that's all that we care about, then we wouldn't be any better than pigs, swine. And Mill replies to this by mentioning the Epicureans, actually. And he says, the comparison of the Epicurean life, that is the life that tries to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, to that of beasts, is felt as degrading precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. But, he goes on to say, there's no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. So what he's pointing out there is that ever since the Epicureans, people who have taken a line like the utilitarians about pleasure being the greatest good, the thing that human beings should be striving for and striving to maximize in their actions, they've recognized that for human beings, the most pleasurable life isn't simply one of sensations. It's not simply one, for instance, of sex and laying out in the sun and eating food that tastes good and things like that. It's also pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments. So where this critic goes wrong, Mill is saying, is in thinking that if human beings are pursuing a life of pleasure, that they must be doing that in the same way that non-human animals do that. But because humans are a special kind of animal, they might be pursuing pleasure in special kinds of ways, including these pleasures of the intellect and so on. So their pleasures, this life of pleasure for human beings, wouldn't have to be beastly in this way. And Mill goes on to make this case by saying that utilitarian writers in general have placed the superiority of mental over bodily pleasures chiefly in the greater permanency, safety, uncostliness, etc. of the former, that is, of the mental pleasures, that is, in their circumstantial advantages rather than in their intrinsic nature. So he may be thinking of Bentham here, and his description certainly applies to Bentham, because Bentham would say that would probably say that most of the pleasures of the intellect and of the moral sentiments and appreciation of the arts and literature and so on yield more pleasure overall than purely momentary hedonistic pleasures like eating as much as you can, or eating a lot, and sex and so on, even though Bentham certainly also recognized the value of those more momentary pleasures. But the point is that a lot of the things that we might think are immediately extremely pleasurable, like think about taking some kind of hard drug or drinking a lot, might feel really good in the moment, but the long-term effects are going to involve a lot of pain. There's a lot of impurity in Bentham's sense to some of those more high intensity immediate pleasures. They have an impurity further down the road. That is, they have a kind of pain cost further down the road. And this has been recognized even by authors like Bentham. But then Mill goes on to say that the utilitarians and that utilitarians in general could take a different line of argument here. He says, but they, utilitarians, might have taken the other and, as it may be called, higher ground with entire consistency. And now he's going to describe what this higher ground involves. He writes, it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. So here he begins to break from what Bentham had said and what Bentham's position is. This is one of Mill's innovations that he's introducing in his view of what utilitarianism is and should be. We're going to read more from Mill about exactly what this alternate version is, but first I want to just give you a picture of what Mill has in mind by the difference between a way of thinking of utilitarianism that includes a consideration of the quality of pleasures as well as their quantity versus a way of thinking of utilitarianism more like Bentham's, which just considers quantity. So in this chart, we have basically a representation of Bentham's approach to calculating the utility of any action. So here I've presented two options for action, option 1 and option 2, and this is just a made-up example, but imagine that, option 1 has an intensity of 5, whereas option 2 has an intensity of 100, and so on with all of the other 7 dimensions of pleasure. And I've kept the extent as just one person to make this comparison easier. When we're done doing this comparison, you might ask whether changing the extent makes a difference here, and that ends up being a slightly puzzling question. But I'll just pass over that for now. We'll just keep the extent at one person affected. So if we compare these two options on Bentham's approach, then it's pretty clear that the second option is the better one because the total utility generated by that option is much higher, mostly because the intensity is higher and the fecundity is higher. The purity is a little bit worse for option 2, that is, there's more pain overall that results from it than in the first case. But because the intensity is so much higher and the fecundity is at least slightly higher, this means that option 2 still has more utility overall on Bentham's approach. So just adding up those numbers, we can see that the utility is greater for option 2, and so it's the option that we should choose according to Bentham's approach. And I've just represented that here by putting a win in that column for total utility. That Bentham's approach says choose the option that has the greater total utility, where utility is calculated purely quantitatively. Now, what Mill is proposing is that there may be another category, another dimension of pleasure in addition to the 7 dimensions that Bentham had listed, which is the quality dimension. Okay, and this quality dimension is going to work a little bit differently from the other 7 dimensions. It's a sort of second order dimension. Okay, it ends up being in some ways more important than all of the quantity dimensions. So what Mill is proposing, and we'll see this in the way he describes it in a few other quotations from the text in just a moment. The way Mill describes this is that if the quality of a pleasure is greater than that of another, then it has the higher utility regardless of how much quantity the two have. So there are cases where there may be a greater quantity of pleasure in one option, but because there's a greater quality of pleasure in the other option, the one that has less quantity of pleasure, the higher quality pleasure is still preferable. Okay, so that's represented here with this addition of the quality row that is ranked as a 2 for option 1 and just a level 1 for option 2. And because option 1 is a level 2, qualitatively, all right, then option 1 ends up being preferable and wins out, even though option 2 has a greater quantity of